Thank you. Thank you for the question and a warm welcome from my side. And I would like to thank the organizers to invite me and to our host, Governor Irina, for very kind words underlying our good or excellent cooperation between the central banks. To the topic, let me start by saying or highlighting the extreme uncertainty that currently we are facing. So in that respect, we hardly talk about baseline, or we can't talk really with certainty what to expect, but we are talking a lot about risks analysis and scenarios. I'll touch upon this also a little bit later. So where the world is going and our economies are going, it's really not clear at the moment. We are facing daily news announcements. So, but what seems to be clear is that this let's say 2 decades of globalization that led to lower prices, efficiency gains, stable commodity prices and producer prices seems to be changing. Let's not put it that it's coming to an end, but we will face a different kind of globalization pattern going ahead, which will of course have implications for our macroeconomies and inflation, and especially for our small open economies in the region. As we've heard before, we are heavily integrated in the global value chains and highly energy dependent. This is another factor that is really influencing our macroeconomic performance more than in other countries. So we need to have these 2 things in mind. And just to give you an example of how this is already being seen in Slovenian economy, where we can say that manufacturing nearly stalled over the last 2 years. And the first quarter GDP growth turned negative. So it was a 0.8% fall in GDP, broad-based, which led us to revise down our growth for this year to just 1.3 from 2.2 from December. A large revision. We also revised for the next year, and then broadly a change for the year after. In terms of inflation, what we see so far is largely the effects of the volatility. So yes, you're asking about the volatility. We had, if you remember, post-pandemic shock to the goods markets, then to the services markets, and of course this affected first highly disproportionately the prices of goods, then services. We all experienced, I guess, in the region. This was also then reflected into the energy prices and the food prices big time. So whether do we see a structural shift, it's to be seen. But just to give an example, exports in Slovenia averaged around 6% in the 15 years prior to the pandemics. For the last, since the pandemics and what we expect, it's below 2%, so average around 2%. So, and the same holds for inflation. We had a period of very low inflation on the core side, coming from the goods disinflation, and now we see a little bit higher inflation there. So to turn about to the outlook, short to medium term, what does it mean for the monetary policy makers? Short to medium term outlook we cover in our projections and we cover in our alternative scenarios. So what we've seen is that the recent global trade fragmentation, it's having detrimental impact, especially through the uncertainty, and we see a cumulative impact on our GDP growth by 1.2% estimated in this 3-year horizon. If we assume the current trade tariffs as they are 10%, if this is lifted to the 20% or the announcement of the April 2nd, that would be more than double. In terms of impact on inflation, as I said before, so far we see mostly the impact of the volatility, but not really a persistent impact. So, however, as mentioned before, this could change. So we could have a persistent upward impact on inflation if we are again exposed to the supply side disruptions. So if we face the scenario of the pandemics, which would be a result of this trade fragmentation and heightened uncertainty, that could of course have a positive impact on inflation going ahead. Let me, on the other hand, the role of structural reforms, we cannot go without saying that. So there is opportunity in this shift for our, in this global shift or sentiment in the trade policies for our economies. So if we invest in our competitiveness in structural reforms, we could benefit. So we could benefit from investment, increased labor productivity, and that would of course have dampening effect on inflationary pressures. So it's really open, I would say, but it's in our hands, in the hands of policies at the EU level and of course global levels. At the end, let me just highlight two more things that we often forget. We talk about trade uncertainties and goods trade that we have in mind, but as I mentioned before, food and energy prices are a very important component on inflation trends and volatility. Normally, we don't talk about it so much because monetary policy traditionally does not respond to these shocks. But what we have been facing now, it has been a series of these shocks that contributed to volatility, and then we have, let's say, increased bias that could lead to increased price expectations and the medium-term outlook for our stability. So, therefore, it's important to take this into account. Also in light of the climate change that we've seen, extreme weather events, so all this can have, let's say, a persistent positive bias to the inflation going ahead.